Mutual flirtation plus double Cleanliness+Wonderful Men on Earth+Charming Fairy Women. 5 years ago, she accidentally provoked her boss and became pregnant with triplets. Mr. Fu, don't you want it? She seduced him in the most direct way after the reunion, in order to borrow seeds to conceive again and save her son. Has Secretary Ruan been so proactive now? Because I have admired Mr. Fu for a long time. It is rumored that Fu Tingzhou is a well-known playboy in the industry, with a strong and charming personality. He only goes by the kidneys, not the heart. She seduces him step by step, causing him to fall, and finally achieves his wish. She is the only woman beside him. She is arrogant, boastful and domineering, which everyone says is his habit. Until his white moonlight returned, news of their engagement spread. She didn't cry or make a fuss, and decisively withdrew. Chapter 1. Mr. Fu, don't you want it? You are listening at novel full.audio. In the suite, the dim light hides endless ambiguity. Two figures kissed each other all the way from the entrance to the foyer and fell onto the soft king bed. Ruan Yen deftly unbuttoned a man's shirt, and this kind of situation only happened once 5 years ago, when he was still the same person. It's just different from the situation 5 years ago. She volunteered this time. Burning with dry firewood, we are about to succeed. The man suddenly grabbed her hand, and all the madness came to an abrupt end. The bedside table lamp lights up. The man sat up in disheveled clothes, his handsome face dreamy in the shadows of the lights, his peach blossom eyes hanging with a playful smile, and his low and pleasant voice. Secretary Ruan, it's only 5 years since we last saw each other. Is that how he took the initiative? Ruan Yen chuckled and hugged his neck, becoming even more radiant. I'm no longer Mr. Fu's secretary, I'm going to change my name, Xiao Ruan. The man in front of her is her former boss, Fu Tingzhou. There are many rumors about Fu Tingzhou. It is said that he is the illegitimate son of Mr. Fu, with an unremarkable identity and not favored by the Fu family, but he can firmly hold the position of CEO of the Fu family. Fu Tingzhou has a great reputation, and of course, the most notable one is his charm. There are countless women around him, almost without any duplicates. He indulges in promiscuity, but does not play any vulgar tricks. He only cares about your feelings and wishes. In a romantic situation, he never goes astray, but he does not mistreat them. Even the breakup fee he gives them is quite considerable. She joined the Fu family 8 years ago to become Fu Tingzhou's secretary, and before her, Fu Tingzhou had already replaced no less than 10 female secretaries. The reason why Fu Tingzhou replaced them was only 3 words: restless, just like the lovers he replaced. He is good at flirting with women, but he has never crossed his heart. The only exception is a woman surnamed Nan. 5 years ago, she was drugged by her adoptive father and given as an item to an old man to seek cooperation benefits. After stumbling the man, she escaped and coincidentally met Fu Tingzhou. She offered herself to Fu Tingzhou despite being drugged and voluntarily chose to resign. This journey will take 5 years. Fu Tingzhou lit a cigarette and slowly exhaled the smoke, watching the woman hooking at him and squinting his eyes meaningfully. Xiao Ruan. This atmosphere should have driven Ruan Yen crazy. But she doesn't want to give up just like this. After all, this is her purpose for returning to China. She flipped over and sat on his lap, boldly and coquettishly pressing against him, and asked softly, Mr. Fu, don't you want it? Fu Tingzhou chuckled and said, I really want to. Ruan Yen kissed his protruding Adam's apple, and she could even clearly feel the changes in his body. She knew he had feelings for her. But he remained indifferent. Perhaps she caressed her a bit too much. Fu Tingzhou crushed the cigarette butt and clasped her wrist. Ruan Yen. Ruan Yen was stunned. Because this is the first time in history that he has called his name so formally. He is most commonly referred to as Secretary Ruan. Before she could recover, Fu Tingzhou pushed her onto the bed, his deep eyes fixed on her bewildered face, and he pulled off the crooked tie with one hand. Just as Ruan Yen thought he would continue with unfinished tasks, he cooperated and hugged him, but Fu Tingzhou tied her hands around the bedside with a tie and immediately smiled. "You've had too much to drink, rest well." He got up and walked towards the bathroom. Listening to the sound of flowing water coming from the bathroom, Ruan Yen looked bewildered. She was rejected. She turned her head to look at the bathroom and her anger suddenly rose. "Fu Tingzhou, can you do it?" However, no response was given at all. Actually, Fu Tingzhou can't do it. She experienced it 5 years ago. It's not impossible, it's very good. She knew Fu Tingzhou well, and Fu Tingzhou never refused to be an active woman, otherwise there would be no endless romantic rumors around him. But he didn't touch her tonight. Or did he perceive his own intentions? Thinking of this, Ruan Yen was filled with regret. She had already known that she had poured medicine for him and finished it. Perhaps because she drank a lot of alcohol tonight to boost her courage, coupled with the nervousness just now, she relaxed and felt a strong sense of drowsiness. After taking a shower, Fu Tingzhou wrapped himself in a bathrobe and walked out of the bathroom. When he saw the woman on the bed falling asleep, he stopped by the bed and stood for a long time. Seeing that the woman seemed to be sleeping restlessly, Fu Tingzhou untied the tie that bound her hands. She suddenly turned over and whimpered in her sleep, "Shaoan." He suddenly stopped, his dark eyes gradually sinking. Chapter 2. Only for the rebirth of the next child. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The next day, Ruan Yen was awakened by the dazzling light and woke up to find that it was already bright outside the window. She sat up in shock. The room is already empty. Obviously, Fu Tingzhou left early. She held on to her forehead, feeling a bit discouraged. Why did she fall asleep last night? Just then, the phone rang. She picked up her phone and saw that it was the hospital's phone number. Ruan Yen withdrew from her room, took a taxi and headed straight to the hospital. She pushed open the door to the ward and saw the little baby sitting on the hospital bed, who had just undergone a doctor's examination, turning her head and feeling suffocated. Ruan Yen smiled helplessly. The doctor asked her to have a private conversation in the hallway. She closed the door and glanced at the ward. "Dr. Su, with my son's condition, can we hold on for a year?" Dr. Su looked at her and said, "It depends on the situation. Currently, the treatment for non-severe aplastic anemia is appropriate. Although the condition is stable and does not threaten the patient's life, the disease progresses quickly and the longer it drags on, the more we cannot guarantee it." Ruan Yen lowered her eyes and said, "Okay, thank you very much." After Dr. Su left, Ruan Yen pushed open the door of the hospital room, and the little baby on the bed snorted again. With her hands on her hips, she turned her face away and said, "Mommy scammer. I've agreed to come back as soon as possible last night." She walked over to the bed and sat down, hugging him and coaxing, "All right, Shaoan, it's Mommy's fault, but Mommy also wants to cure your illness quickly." 5 years ago, she left Beijing and went abroad to pursue her college friend Zhao Haitang. It wasn't long before she found out that she was pregnant. Or triplets. The eldest is named Nanmo, the second is a daughter named Xingyi, and the youngest son is named Chenan. When she was abroad, she almost took her life to give birth to these 3 children. It is said that during a cesarean section, due to the nurse's careless handling of the wrong information, an excessive amount of anesthesia was used. Although she and her 3 children were successfully saved during the rescue process, it also prevented the youngest son from having a healthy body. Due to his weak and sickly physique, he was unable to play recklessly like his older brothers and sisters, and went to kindergarten. After all, aplastic anemia caused him to be unable to clot, and even a small bump would cause him to bleed profusely, which could only be treated with medication. To completely cure Chenan, either a close relative bone marrow transplant or hematopoietic stem cell transplantation using umbilical cord blood delivered from the fetus is necessary. But her bone marrow and Chen An's cannot match with the other 2 babies, and she doesn't want playboys like Fu Tingzhou to know about the existence of a few children. So when she brought Qianan back to China, she planned to take care of him while borrowing the seeds from Fu Tingzhou to have another child. Use the umbilical cord blood of that child to treat Qianan's illness. Qianan looked at her and said, "Mommy, will my illness really get better?" Looking at the innocent face of the child, Ruan Yan's heart trembled slightly. She raised her hand to stroke his head and smiled, "Fool, of course I will. Your brothers and sisters are all waiting for you to cure your illness." Qianan pursed his lips and said, "Then I'm fine. Will Daddy come back?" Ruan Yan. She used to deceive her children that their father was working far away, but she knew that telling a lie would require countless lies to cover it up. "Yes," she said, "you're talking nonsense. Don't just think we're kids to deceive us. You lied to us saying that Dad was mining in Africa, and when we went to kindergarten, we went to find Dad. Dad didn't find him, and you lied to the man who wanted to pursue you, saying that you killed 2 husbands, causing the neighbor's son's mother to say you were a widow, but you never got married." Ruan Yan couldn't help but laugh and cry, "Well, this time it's true. When you recover from your illness, I will definitely find your dad." Qianan sighed and said, "Mommy, I can't finish the pancakes you drew for us when I recover from my illness." Ruan Yan. After Qianan had lunch and rested, Ruan Yan opened her laptop and skillfully operated the hacker page, hacking into the defense system of the Fu group and immediately deleting all traces without leaving any room for error. After finishing all of this, she picked up her phone and contacted a Gao Yao man, asking him to release her newly developed defense system 3 days later and only sell it to Fu Shi. Gao Yao was surprised and said, "Sister Yan, didn't you say it's not for sale? I want to sell now." "But what if Fu doesn't buy it?" Ruan Yan chuckled lightly, since hackers can identify their system vulnerabilities, in order to prevent loss of profits, they will definitely consider it. 3 days later, Ruan Yan received a call from Gao Yao, who said that Fu agreed to cooperate and arranged for a face-to-face meeting. She applied lipstick in front of the mirror with a calm expression and said, "Is the person you are contacting the CEO of Fu's company?" "I didn't contact Mr. Fu, I just had a conversation with Mr. Fu's senior management, who said they would report to their CEO." Ruan Yan paused for a few seconds and said, "Okay, I understand. Let me handle the rest." Hanging up the phone, she looked at the reflection of her exquisitely made-up face in the mirror, which was completely opposite to herself 8 years ago. In order to break free from her vampire-like foster family, she entered the Fu family. She heard that Fu Tingzhou was a playboy, so during her 3 years at the Fu family, she did not wear a dress or put on makeup. The only way to approach Fu Tingzhou openly and honestly upon returning to China this time is to have the opportunity to cooperate with the Fu family. Although this opportunity was her disgraceful means. But for the sake of the child, she can sacrifice all the costs. Received the interview address, Ruan Yan tidied up her makeup and hair, and set off for the hotel. She had just stepped out of the taxi when a black Barton parked wildly at the front door. The off-road vehicle model is spacious and domineering. In the capital, whether it's a Rolls-Royce Bentley or a Lamborghini supercar for wealthy travelers, it's the only one who loves off-road. Bold and quite low-key. 2 bodyguards opened the car door for him, stepped out with long legs, and soon the familiar tall figure stood in front of the car door. The light and shadow gradually condensed, and the handsome face went from hazy to clear. The black suit on his body was still without ties or buttons. In her memory, he rarely wears a formal suit, even when attending meetings or grand banquets, he goes his own way. Others say that he is arrogant and his methods are dirty, making him an illegitimate child who cannot stand the stage. However, it cannot be denied that no matter how famous his reputation is, only he can manage the Fu family in an orderly manner. The suddenly shrouded shadow brought her to her senses. Looking up, she saw that Fu Tingzhou had already stopped in front of her, with a playful smile in his peach blossom eyes. He paused word by word, Xiao Ruan. She was somewhat surprised by his appearance. Quickly, she covered all the marks on the surface with a smile and took the initiative to hold Fu Tingzhou's hand. It's a coincidence, it turns out that the collaborator is Mr. Fu, she said, although all of this is in her plan. He hummed, his tall figure leaning forward slightly, and he stood on the steps in front of her. He was already tall, but now he almost covered her. Are you representing Till? Perhaps this is fate. Ruan Yen tidied up his clothes for him, which surprised all the bodyguards present. Even though there are countless women around Mr. Fu, no woman dares to touch him without his consent. Fu Tingzhou stared at her. She has a smile in her eyes, like a wave of autumn water, which appears affectionate to outsiders. But only he knew that she had no feelings for him in her eyes. He clasped her wrist, and at the moment when Ruan Yen was slightly stunned, he chuckled softly, "That's quite fate." Chapter 3. I have admired Mr. Fu for a long time. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Thinking of the man who was only responsible for teasing the fire last night and not for sowing seeds, Ruan Yen restrained her expression and distanced herself from him. Mr. Fu, let's go in and talk about business, she said. Indulge in the pursuit of capture and cannot be used frequently. He needs to occasionally hang his appetite to have an effect. Fu Tingzhou smiled as if nothing had happened and led someone in first. There were several people sitting in the private room, all managed by Fu's technical department. After Ruan Yen stepped into the private room, Fu Tingzhou was already sitting in the main seat, while the guest seat on his right side was empty. He casually spun the teacup without looking up. The management of the technical department knows Ruan Yen. After all, she was once the secretary of Fu Tingzhou and also the longest-serving female secretary. Secretary Ruan, I didn't expect you to be the representative of Till Technology. It seems that after Secretary Ruan resigns, the prospects are also good. Ruan Yen politely squeezed out a smile and nodded. Just as a senior executive wanted to sit down, Ruan Yen walked straight to the empty seat next to Fu Tingzhou in front of everyone and naturally sat down. Everyone was surprised. Fu Tingzhou lifted his eyelids and remained silent. The entire process of discussing the project went smoothly. Ruan Yen and the technical department demonstrated the characteristics of the new defense system developed by Till, and also had the technician practice it on site using a computer. The technician was unable to find the vulnerability in the firewall and failed several times in a row. While people praised Till as a pioneer of internet technology, they also waited for Fu Tingzhou's opinion. Fu Tingzhou gently shook the wine in his glass and casually drank it slowly. Sending charcoal in the snow is quite good, he said. Ruan Yen's body seemed to be not getting close to him. Till is also looking forward to working with Mr. Fu. He smiled and said, did Till expect it, or did you expect it? She smiled and bent her eyes. She took off one of her shoes under the table and lightly touched the man's ankle with the tip of her thin stockings, as if unintentionally saying, I look forward to it too. Fu Tingzhou stared at her seductive appearance, indifferent. Ruan Yen also accepted the situation and did not continue. The waiter brought the food to the table and placed the plates one by one. When he saw the coriander in Fu Tingzhou's plates, Ruan Yen almost instinctively replaced it for him. A person's professional habits have not been changed. During her 3 years as a secretary, she did not hesitate to learn about Fu Tingzhou's likes and dislikes, simply because Fu Tingzhou's taste was very picky. For that job, she almost put a lot of effort into it. For example, coffee can only be freshly ground, with half a sugar added, no more or less, and the cup must be placed next to his left hand. Steak only eats beef tenderloin, which must be medium cooked and not frozen. No cilantro can be found in any food. Fu Tingzhou squinted his eyes and leaned half an inch closer to her. I can't believe Xiao Ruan still knows me so well. She remained calm and composed, turned her head to meet his gaze, and smiled. After all, I still remember Mr. Fu's habits and preferences vividly and cannot forget them. He had a deeper smile and said, really? After discussing the project and finishing the meal, we also managed to hold out until the end. The other responsible persons bid farewell one after another, leaving only Fu Tingzhou and Ruan in the private room. The waiter knew there were still guests in the private room and wouldn't come in to tidy up. Ruan picked up a handkerchief and wiped the corners of her mouth. "Mr. Fu, won't you leave?" Fu Tingzhou's arm lay horizontally on the back of her chair. "Isn't this giving you a chance?" Ruan also looked at him. Fu Tingzhou fixed his gaze on her carefully dressed appearance. She was very beautiful, even without any makeup. She was pure and charming. Wearing makeup and exuding a myriad of charm, yet not seductive. He pinched her chin with his fingertips and lifted her slightly. "Secretary Ruan came to China specifically to seduce me." Seduce. Although exposed, Ruan did not panic and instead smiled. "How can we say seduction? I have admired Mr. Fu for a long time." Chapter 4. Tempting red lips, very deceptive. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Fu Tingzhou pressed his fingertips against her lips, wiping away her blush. He seemed to smile again, but there was no smile in his eyes. "I admire you. Why did you resign 5 years ago?" Her expression froze without a trace. But he quickly recovered, pretending to be aggrieved and pitiful. "Because I broke the rules." "What rules?" "I climbed onto Mr. Fu's bed and became one of those restless secretaries. Instead of waiting to be fired by Mr. Fu, it's better to resign myself, which can save me some face." She has a bright and dazzling smile. But it also harbors false feelings. He leaned against the back of the chair, his shirt pressed tightly against his broad and sturdy chest. As he breathed, he suddenly smiled and said, "Your tempting red lips are quite deceitful." Ruan looked innocent and said, "I'm not lying. When you come to my place at night, I want to see the sincerity of Secretary Ruan," he said, picking up his coat and walking straight out of the private room. Faced with his sincere invitation, Ruan naturally wouldn't refuse. Instead of persuading him to give herself a child, it would be more convenient for him to steal the seeds directly in his sleepwear. At night, after Chenan fell asleep, Ruan took a taxi to the Fu mansion and also went to a pharmacy on the way. After arriving at the Fu mansion, she rang the doorbell. Bodyguard Lin opened the door and was surprised to see that it was her. "Miss Ruan. Mr. Fu asked me to come over." "Mr. Fu is in the study." Lin immediately understood. Without saying anything, Ruan walked straight towards the elevator. Coming to Fu mansion, she is already quite familiar with the road. "After all, I haven't come here less than 3 years to deliver documents to him." Stepping out of the elevator, Ruan changed into a charming smile and walked towards the study. Fu Tingzhou was indeed in the study. He was wearing a dark blue nightgown and gold-rimmed glasses, sitting behind the desk reading documents while fiddling with the antique globe on the table. The whole person is relaxed and comfortable. Ruan chuckled. "This skin bag is truly a man stepping on the ceiling of jeans. Except for his illegitimate background, his good skin is almost perfect, and there is no flaw in any angle. Even the figure is impeccable. It's not an exaggeration for women to be fascinated by his appearance." Fu Tingzhou lifted his eyelids and said, "Are you here so soon?" Ruan took off her coat, and her thin outer robe slipped onto the tiled floor. Inside, she was only wearing a black velvet suspender dress, which was a very curvaceous dress. Fu Tingzhou looked around, but then lowered his head to look at the documents. Seeing his serious appearance, Ruan couldn't help but feel amused in her heart. She was as passionate as those lovers when they were together, and even more reserved than before. What a hypocritical man. Ruan walked up to him, took off the document in his hand, and immediately sat sideways on his lap. "Mr. Fu, isn't he cowardly on the battlefield?" Fu Tingzhou chuckled lightly and hugged her waist with his palm, holding a soft fragrance in his arms. How could he remain indifferent and say, "Sincerity"? Ruan kissed his lips without hesitation. Fu Tingzhou lowered his eyes and looked at the face within reach, trying to suppress something. She is not proficient in kissing, as green and astringent as 5 years ago, but rather more like gnawing randomly. Perhaps her hair was fragrant, soft, and exuding deadly temptations, causing him to lose control. He grabbed the back of her head in his palm and turned the tables on her. Induce him to break the precepts, just be willing to go out. Ruan Yen caressed him, his ears also filled with heavy breathing. Fu Tingzhou lifted her to the table, and the two seemed to be on the brink of madness, but they never managed to tear through that edge. Ruan Yen was worried that he would change his mind like last night, so she suddenly stopped him and said, "Mr. Fu." His eyes were dark, and his Adam's apple rolled down. I want to drink alcohol." Fu Tingzhou lifted his eyelids and scrutinized her, drinking. Did Chapter 5 know her intention? You are listening at novelfull.audio. She smiled brightly and said with all kinds of charm, "Why, are we not allowed to have fun after drinking?" Fu Tingzhou's thin lips floated up, "Of course not." Ruan Yen used an excuse to look for wine, but when she arrived at the lounge and saw no one around, she rubbed out a thin and small package of medicine stuffed into her chest. Given last night's failure, how could she not have prepared in advance when she came? She poured the medicine into the wine and shook it well, until the precipitated medicinal foam dissolves in this red wine. After finishing everything, Ruan Yen returned to the study with 2 glasses of wine. Fu Tingzhou, not feeling sick, slowly closed his laptop and looked at her, his gaze fixed on the drink she brought. "It's quite charming," he said. Ruan Yen moved the glass of wine that had been drugged to him and said, "Can you have a drink with me?" Fu Tingzhou picked up a glass of wine and gently shook it. Ruan Yen had already finished drinking the wine from the cup, but Yu Guang stared at Fu Tingzhou. Fu Tingzhou took a sip and smiled, "How about having a glass of wine? I need to trouble Secretary Ruan to bring another bottle of wine." Ruan Yen thought that he couldn't escape tonight, so she went out to get another bottle. When she returned to her study, she found that Fu Tingzhou was already lying on the desk. And the wine glasses on the table were almost bottomed out. Ruan Yen put down the wine bottle and approached him, shaking his body. "Fu Tingzhou." He didn't react. Ruan Yen's heart thumped for a moment and said, "It's broken. I shouldn't have gone down too much, right?" But she can't care about so much anymore, she can only force herself. Ruan Yen spent 9 cows and 2 tigers to get Fu Tingzhou onto the bed. Seeing Fu Tingzhou frowning, she felt a little relieved. After all, it's not completely unconscious yet. Ruan Yen climbed onto the bed, and as soon as he untied his nightgown belt, the man underneath suddenly opened his eyes and turned over, trapping her in front of him. Ruan Yen was surprised. "You?" Fu Tingzhou sneered and raised his eyebrows lightly. "Next time Secretary Ruan takes the medicine, it's better to choose a corner without surveillance." Ruan Yen realized that he had played with him again and was so angry that she pushed him away, but couldn't push him away. "Fu Tingzhou, is it fun?" Fu Tingzhou smiled instead of getting angry. "I thought you wouldn't get angry." He has never seen her angry before. "Get up." She was really angry enough to fight him recklessly. This man is clearly playing with her. Is it because we know her intentions? But she does have an intention. The fire that instantly rose from the bottom of my heart also wilted. Fu Tingzhou lowered his head and leaned against her. "Do you just want to sleep with me?" Want to sleep? If it weren't for his son, he wouldn't be worthy to sleep with her. She turned her head and said, "I don't want to do it now, can I?" He smiled and said, "You have a pretty bad temper." Fu Tingzhou flipped over to her side and hugged her, causing Ruan Yen to instinctively freeze. Because besides sleeping with him and sowing seeds, she never thought of any intimate actions with him beyond that purpose. "Isn't it sleeping? Let's sleep." Ruan Yen was puzzled. "Do you want to sleep?" He held his forehead with one hand and laughed. "It's not sleeping with me, it's sleeping." Ruan Yen pushed away his hand and simply turned his back to him. Who is Shaoan? As Ruan Yan's heart thumped, the air fell silent for a moment. She still turned her back to the man behind her, her hands slightly curled up and said, "What little Anne?" He spoke calmly, "Last night you called out this person's name. Who is this person?" Ruan Yan's spine stiffened. Did she talk in her sleep last night? But he can question, so he probably doesn't know the identity of the child yet. A friend. Friend. Fu Tingzhou approached her half an inch, and the temperature in his eyes gradually faded. Man. Ruan Yen is confused. Is it important for men to be women? Besides, why does he have to ask this? Unfortunately, she couldn't hesitate for too long, let alone mess around. Mr. Fu, this is my personal matter, and I haven't asked about your personal matters, Mr. Fu. She said the implication is that she doesn't care about his private affairs, and he shouldn't be involved either. Fu Tingzhou smiled and said, "You want to sleep with me, but you still hide something from me. How can I not be on guard?" Chapter 6. Gossip. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Ruan Yen admitted that after returning to China, she became entangled with Fu Tingzhou and wanted to sleep with him, which was indeed too obvious. Having failed twice, he must have become suspicious. She underestimated his composure. The key is for the child, she is too anxious. Ruan Yen took a deep breath, calmed her mood, and immediately got up to tidy up her clothes. It's normal that so many women around Mr. Fu don't like me, but Mr. Fu can rest assured that I won't have any thoughts about Mr. Fu in the future. Fu Tingzhou squinted his eyes and said, "You're not sleeping anymore. Don't disturb Mr. Fu's rest." She picked up her bag and left. Not long after hurriedly leaving the villa, Lin Yi caught up in a car and said, "Miss Ruan, Mr. Fu asked me to take you back. You can get in the car." "No need, thank you. Miss Ruan, it's not easy for me to explain to Mr. Fu like this. You'd better let me see you off." Lin Yi showed a puzzled expression. Ruan Yen stopped in her tracks. Thinking it would be difficult to get a taxi so late, Yilin and I escorted her back. After returning to the apartment, Ruan Yen took a shower and walked out of the bathroom, wiping her hair with a towel. She suddenly stopped in front of the mirror, looking at the hard-to-conceal marks on her neck. It's just one step away. Given her two failures, it was her arrogance and blindness. She believed that she knew him well and that Fu Tingzhou could not refuse any woman's indulgence and support. After all, she was a promiscuous woman with no shortage of women around her. She was not entangled, did not pursue his status, fame, or wealth, and was the most suitable candidate for him. As long as she successfully becomes pregnant, she will take her child and fly far away. At least before returning to her home country, she believed that everything would go smoothly. Ruan Yen propped her hands on the table and couldn't help but tighten them. It seems that we need to deal with it seriously. The next day, Ruan Yen went to the hospital to accompany her child. Chenin leaned against the bedside to read an illustrated storybook and looked at Ruan Yen. "Mommy, if you still have work, you can go and get busy first," she said. Ruan Yen smiled and raised her hand to rub his hair. "Mommy is not busy, there is still some time to accompany you," she said. After Chenin took a nap, Ruan Yen came to the Tier Technology branch and presented her work ID to the front desk. Not long after, General Manager Teal came out to greet him and said, "Representative Ruan, why didn't you notify us in advance when you came to our branch?" Ruan Yen calmly put away her work documents and said, "I need to stay at the branch for a period of time, so I have to trouble Manager Su during this time." Manager Su also smiled and said, "No trouble, we have also received a call from Director Gao to inquire about the situation. Till's headquarters is in Washington, and the top management of the branch is Gao Yao. Although she personally collaborates with Fu Shi under Till's name, there must still be some form that should be in place." Manager Su took her to a separate office and introduced her to the entire department. After a brief greeting with other employees, Ruan Yen became busy in the office. For a week in a row, Ruan Yen was not actively seeking help from Fu Tingzhou, either in the hospital or in the company. On the one hand, her previous impatience caused suspicion in the other party. On the other hand, it is to make progress by retreating. She needs a suitable timing at this moment. A news push popped up on the phone screen, and Ruan Yen casually glanced at it and paused. Put down your work and pick up your phone to read. President Fu has a rendezvous with a popular female celebrity winery, suspecting that they will spend the night together. Ruan Yen couldn't help but mock upon seeing this news. When facing oneself, pretend to be a gentleman, but sleep quite diligently with other women. It's really disgusting. She restrained her expression, disgusted with the child's life, and chose the latter. Ruan Yen sent a message to Gao Yao, asking him to check Fu Tingzhou's itinerary for tonight. At the Blissful Club. Chapter 7. Smashing the Scene. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Around 9 p.m., Ruan Yen changed into a brand outfit and arrived at the Blissful Club. She walked to the front desk and placed her shoulder bag on the table. Which private room is Mr. Fu in? The front desk waiter's gaze fell on the branded bag in her hand, which was a discerning person with a price in at least 6 digits. It's definitely not easy for a woman to come to Mr. Fu wearing a famous brand. Mr. Fu is the number one in the human world. Human number one is a VIP bag for the Blissful Club, with a minimum cost of 10,000 yuan. It is not uncommon to spend over 100,000 yuan per night, as there is not much money in my pocket and I really can't afford it. Thank you. She smiled and immediately walked towards the elevator. Take the elevator to the VIP bag on the 3rd floor, where several waiters and bodyguards are waiting outside box 1. Ruan Yen picked up the makeup mirror from her bag, rubbed her lips red, everything was ready, pulled on the hair rope, and her long black hair flowed down like a waterfall. She casually pushed it backwards and walked towards the private room with an imposing presence. The waiter outside the door noticed her, carrying a branded bag and dressed beautifully. With this imposing demeanor, he thought that some man's palace had come to arrest her. The bodyguards saw her approaching and wanted to stop her. Ruan Yen pushed him away and shouted, "You dare to stop me too?" She pushed open the door and said, "You heartless person, dare to steal food behind my back." There were not many people in the private room, with 4 men and 5 women. The sudden sound also made everyone inside look at her. In this murky and gloomy atmosphere, only a handsome man was smoking in the shadows, sitting in a bold and unrestrained posture, with his shirt open to his chest, both wild and charming. Placed in the crowd, it is a dazzling sight that can be noticed at a glance. And the girl sitting beside him, pouring wine for him, was obviously also frightened by this commotion. The man beside him, who was drunk, stood up and said, "Who are you?" Fu Tingzhou lifted his eyelids and looked at her. Ruan Yen walked towards Fu Tingzhou, stopped in front of him, and glanced at the woman beside him. "Please move," she said. The woman looked cautiously at Fu Tingzhou, as if waiting for a signal. Fu Tingzhou dusted off his cigarette ash and chuckled, "Looking for me?" Ruan Yen leaned down to look at him and casually made up, "Lin-Yi sent me a text message saying that you were drunk and he was worried about you. He asked me to come and take a look." Lin-Yi is a capable subordinate of Fu Tingzhou, and everyone present knows it. And if she could name Lin-Yi, that relationship would surely be remarkable. The woman stood up wisely now. "Oh, Fu Xiao, which woman are you hiding? Why haven't you brought it out before?" Everyone else followed in cheering. Fu Tingzhou looked up and slowly exhaled smoke. His deep and unfathomable eyes said, "I have too many women, I don't remember." Ruan Yen didn't care. Disrupting his enjoyment, she was also quite satisfied. She stood up straight, pretending to be sad, "Yeah, after all, I'm just one of many people. Fu Xiao forgot about me, how can I blame Fu Xiao?" The drunken man grinned and said, "Beautiful woman, if you want to show off your emotions, it's better to show off your feelings to me. I'm very dedicated. Ruan Yen sneered, okay, then next time I'll consider you. I just like beautiful women to be so refreshing. Come and have a drink with me. Ruan Yen was about to pick up the wine glass on the table when Fu Tingzhou lightly swept her hand. The glass in front of her instantly fell to the ground, and with the sound of shattering, the atmosphere in the private room instantly fell silent. Ruan Yen is not sure why. Fu Tingzhou leaned back in his chair and said, sorry, I drank too much. The drunken man was about to say something when someone stopped him. Seeing that the situation was not right, the man quickly made up for it and said, Master Fu, we've all had enough to drink, so we'll go back first. The people in the private room have all dispersed. Quickly empty. Only she and Fu Tingzhou are left. She looked down at the mess on the ground and pretended to be aggrieved. Mr. Fu, shouldn't I have accidentally smashed the scene? Fu Tingzhou's gaze lifted the mist and looked at her in a daze, as if she was drunk or awake, both of which were difficult to see through. Chapter 8. Who is that man? You are listening at novelfull.audio. For a long time, Fu Tingzhou threw the cigarette butt into the glass of wine, and the spark suddenly went out. Accompanied by his deep voice, can I understand that Secretary Ruan deliberately did it? She chuckled lightly and said, yes, after all, I'm quite angry. Fu Tingzhou paused, lifted his eyelids, and laughed. What are you angry about? I'm jealous. She spoke confidently. Without any hint of emotion. Fu Tingzhou smiled and lit another cigarette, smoking with mist swirling around. Are you jealous? Just don't believe it. Ruan Yen was about to leave when Fu Tingzhou grabbed her wrist. She accidentally fell into his arms, her body froze for a moment, but she still cooperated. Mr. Fu, don't you want me to leave? Fu Tingzhou flicked his fingertips at the tip of her hair, brushing his nose against the faint fragrance of wild roses and clover. His voice was hoarse. Secretary Ruan still doesn't want to tell me, who is that man? She paused for a few seconds, still turning her back to him and frowning. Is it important? He chuckled and said, I can't even achieve the most basic level of honesty. Don't Secretary Ruan feel guilty when he says these things? Ruan Yen is speechless. Could it be that he still needs to be physically and mentally clean when looking for women, and cannot entangle with other men? I understand that he has always been picky about food and taste, but I didn't expect even women to be picky. What double-standard psychology? Ruan Yen took the cigarette he held between his fingers and crushed it in the ashtray. If I say Shaoan is a cute little repair dog I keep, do you believe it? Fu Tingzhou laughed and said, isn't it about friends? She caught the words and said, isn't a dog the most loyal friend of humans? Shaoan, Mom is sorry for you first. Fu Tingzhou scrutinized her, seeming to be speculating on the truth behind her words. She lowered her gaze without showing any trace and changed the topic. It's getting late. I'll call Lin to pick you up and go back. Ruan Yen pulled out his phone, but he didn't stop her. As she lowered her head to look for Lin Yi's number, Fu Tingzhou hugged her waist and buried it on the side of her neck. The damp and hot breath sprayed on her skin, making her instinctively stiff. Mr. Fu. His voice was hoarse, his lips brushing over her snowy neck as if not kissing. What's wrong, don't you want it anymore? She felt his strong change. Ruan Yen bit her lip and frowned even tighter, trying to conceal her physical discomfort. She only wants to save the child, and she doesn't care how many women he has and how much fun he plays. Fu Tingzhou has read countless women and has never contracted any dirty diseases, indicating that he values safety measures very much. Except for the night 5 years ago when they were shot with real bullets. Just thinking about him having sex with other women before and touching herself again, she felt it was just a coincidence. Moreover, if she obeys so quickly, she may still be fooled by him like she did the previous 2 times. She doesn't want to make any extra mistakes. I don't want to tonight. Fu Tingzhou chuckled lightly and twisted her face with his fingertips. Why? Ruan Yen pushed away his hand and quickly stood up. You have the scent of other women on you. He adjusted his slightly messy suit and laughed even deeper. Are you sure it's not the smell from you? Ruan Yen ignored him and returned his phone, looking like a jealous little woman who was angry with him. I helped you make a phone call, you can answer it yourself, she said. Fu Tingzhou answered the phone, and shortly after, Lin Yi rushed to the private room. He didn't ask much about Ruan Yan's appearance either. Leaving the club, Fu Tingzhou sat in the car first. Lin Yi then turned around and asked her, Miss Ruan, are you going to Fu Mansion or? Fu Tingzhou turned his head to look at her. Ruan Yen pretended to be angry and said, what kind of mansion should I go to? If I don't go, I won't go in the future. After finishing speaking, Chong Chong closed the car door for him and turned around to leave. Lin Ruzhang, the second monk, couldn't figure it out and said, this woman changes whenever she says she changes. Mr. Fu, why don't you coax her? Fu Tingzhou watched her take a taxi and smiled as she sat back in the chair, pulling apart her collar. Do you need me to comfort her? Maybe the weather will pass in a couple of days, he said. Lin Yi. The next day, Ruan Yen accompanied her child to breakfast and came to the branch office without bias. Passing by the newspaper stand, she witnessed her affair with Fu Tingzhou. The big characters suspected of Fu Xiao's lover catching adultery in the clubhouse are extremely prominent. Chapter 9 is on holiday, inconvenient. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Ruan Yen picked up the daily newspaper and from the perspective of taking photos, it was the person in the private room, although only her profile was captured. I didn't expect to be involved in a scandal with Fu Tingzhou in this way. However, after all the fuss he had last night, Fu Tingzhou probably wouldn't think of any other women in the short term. After all, she openly expressed her love and did not let him succeed, so she did not believe that Fu Tingzhou had not yet taken the bait. Representative Ruan, you're here. I was just about to call you. Upon hearing the sound, Ruan Yen put the newspaper back, deliberately flipped over the back, and turned to look at Manager Su walking towards him. What's wrong? Mr. Fu called and said that the defense system software you sold them has a vulnerability, and you need to go and handle it. Ruan Yen frowned. There is a loophole. That day during the test, there was no mention of such a thing. But she didn't dare to think much. After all, she couldn't miss the opportunity to cooperate with Fu Tingzhou just because of a small problem. Ruan Yen quickly arrived at the Fu family, and Lin Yi seemed to have been waiting in the lobby for a long time. As she approached, she said, Miss Ruan, Mr. Fu is waiting for you in the office. Ruan Yen nodded and walked into the elevator with him. When he arrived at the administrative office, he pushed open the door and saw Fu Tingzhou sitting on the sofa with his legs crossed, his black suit slightly open, but his inner shirt was straight and meticulous. He held his forehead with one hand, his index finger at the end of his eyebrows, and his gaze fell on the computer screen. As usual, casual and lazy. After Lin Yi brought her there, he stepped back and instinctively brought her to the door. Ruan Yen guessed what had come to her mind, pulled her long hair behind her ear, and walked towards him with a smile. Mr. Fu wouldn't be using this method to lure me over, would he? Fu Tingzhou lifted his eyelids and turned the computer screen towards her. Take a look. Ruan Yen was stunned for a moment, restrained her smile, and walked to the computer to check. How to detect it. The sandbox protection, newly added isolation push, and delayed release security mechanism are all displayed as normal. She frowned and said, no problem. Fu Tingzhou witnessed her operation, his mouth curled and his arm crossed the back of the chair behind her, leaning closer. Are you using your own system on your computer? She turned back and said, what's wrong? He smiled meaningfully. So coincidentally, the internal internet system of Fu Shi was broken not long ago, and the counter-tracking found that the defense system used by the other party was somewhat similar to this model. Ruan Yan's back stiffened to prevent being noticed. She turned her head to meet his gaze and smiled. That's quite a coincidence, but the system developed by Teal mainly enhances the protection mechanism, and there are many buyers. Fu Tingzhou not only has high vigilance, but also a strong suspicion, almost causing her to lose control. Fu Tingzhou looked at her and squinted. You're not wearing a dress today. She casually evaded. I'm on my period break, it's inconvenient. She doesn't like to dress up, nor does she like to wear skirts, unless it's to seduce him. He smiled and said, no wonder you were reserved last night. Ruan Yen choked and snorted lightly for a moment, revealing a hint of grievance. Mr. Fu only focuses on getting tired of other women. No matter how passionate I am, it's useless. Just let it go. Fu Tingzhou leaned half an inch closer to her, his breath brushing against her forehead and hair. He whispered in her ear, if you hadn't mentioned drinking at Fu Mansion that night, maybe I would have followed. Ruan Yen. Behind the scenes. She stood up and said, the system has checked and there are no issues. Can I leave now? Can you help me make a cup of coffee? Ruan Yan's heart was stirred up and down by him just now, and now it's being manipulated, so there's a bit of resentment inside. After a moment's thought, her cunning eyes flashed over her and she leaned over to him, just a stone's throw away. Is there any benefit in helping Mr. Fu brew coffee? She said. Chapter 10. Taking Advantage of Advantages. You are listening at novelfull.audio. She is no longer Fu Tingzhou's secretary, so naturally she doesn't have to listen to his orders, but he has already spoken up, and this advantage must be taken advantage of first. Fu Tingzhou penetrated her thoughts and raised his eyebrows. Do you still want to take advantage of me? For example, having a meal and scheduling something. Ruan Yen hooked his tie and played with it in her palm, her smile becoming increasingly bright. Fu Tingzhou stared at her silently. Despite not being meticulously dressed up, let alone the glamorous makeup, the myriad of emotions conveyed in the bones are irresistible. Even if it's a trap, I am willing to fall into it. His eyes were dark and gloomy, just for a moment, a clear and clear sky, like a Buddha without desires or desires. With a beautiful woman in his arms, he remained calm and composed. Just having a meal is enough. Otherwise, how else does Mr. Fu want to satisfy me? Ruan Yen pushed open one of his buttons, his collar burst open, and the beauty of his chest suddenly appeared. She wanted to see how reserved Fu Tingzhou could be. After a while, Fu Tingzhou grabbed her shoulder and gently pushed her away. Didn't it mean it was a period break? What are you fussing about? Ruan Yan's lips curved slightly. She knew that Fu Tingzhou had feelings. Confirming this is enough. Did Mr. Fu agree to have dinner with me? Fu Tingzhou stood up and walked to his desk, picked up the document. Secretary Ruan warmly invited me, can I refuse? Ruan Yen turned her head and brewed coffee in the tea room. Fu Tingzhou put down the documents and picked up the landline to make a phone call. Not long after, Ruan Yen came out with coffee, which was traditionally placed on his left side. He didn't forget to take the business card from the corner of his table and waved it at him with his fingertips. He blew back a kiss and said, contact me later, goodbye. She didn't stay for a moment and left straight away. Walking to the elevator, a female staff member happened to pass by holding tea and said, Secretary Ruan, did you leave so quickly? Ruan Yen looked up and saw her former colleague. She politely nodded and smiled, yeah. By the way, this is brown sugar water. Mr. Fu instructed me to bring it to you. I was just about to deliver it to your office. Ruan Yen looked at the brown sugar water in her hand and shook her mind slightly. Half a minute later, she hesitated and took the brown sugar water from the other person's hand. Thank you. After the female employee left, Ruan Yen lowered her eyes and looked at the brown sugar water in her hand, pondering for a long time. She just casually mentioned the physiological period, and Fu Tingzhou had people soak in brown sugar water. What exactly does this mean? Not long after Ruan Yen left, Lin Yi entered the office and Fu Tingzhou sat in the swivel chair, lost in thought. In Lin's eyes, his whole body seemed as if his soul had been hooked away. Mr. Fu. Fu Tingzhou raised his eyes and said, "Did you find out?" Lin Yi lowered his head and replied, "Miss Ruan only had one woman named Zhao Haitang by her side in the United States during those years. The other person divorced and had 3 children. I really couldn't find the man you mentioned." In the evening, Ruan Yen sat in the hospital room to accompany Chenan for a meal, probably still pondering about what happened at the Fu family today, appearing absent-minded. Although Chenan is young, his mind is sharper than his brothers and sisters. "Mommy, are you troubled by something?" She snapped back and said, "No, Mommy was thinking about something else." Is it Fu Tingzhou intentionally probing her about the system issue? In general, it is impossible to detect her tampering, especially since her professional strength is in the field of information systems engineering. When she first joined the Fu family, she concealed this fact. The defense system was designed by her, and even top hackers in the industry find it difficult to track her down. How could Fu Tingzhou suspect her? It seemed that she had a complex expression on her face. Chenan pursed his lips and hugged his arms, saying, "Mommy, did you do something bad?" She choked and coughed lightly, "Mommy didn't do anything wrong. By the way, Mommy, today a nurse aunt said that I look very much like a person." Ruan Yen was stunned for a moment and said, "Like who?" Chenan pulled out a magazine from under his pillow and pointed to a familiar man on the magazine cover, "Like him."